everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, a lot of people have recognized that despite the middle class being one of the core pieces of the American story, one of the core pieces of the American identity, and a group that should, in some ways, have a lot of influence on the way the country is going, somehow this group is the one group that doesn't have anyone who's actually fighting for them. And I wanted to talk a little bit today as to why we find ourselves in this situation. How did Middle America get here? Why is no one championing Middle America? And how can that change? Joining me today to talk about that is C.Jay Engel. He is the host of the Chronicles Magazine podcast, along with a few others. CJ, thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You wrote a great piece about this. It's a long one, but it's a good one. People should definitely check it out. It's over at the American Reformer. And I wanted to bring you on because I think you did a great job of addressing this problem, pulling from a couple different sources, explaining some of the tensions that are really at the heart of the conservative movement and why it doesn't actually represent most of Middle America and maybe some of the ways forward. So the piece that you wrote was called Revolution from the Middle, taking its name from the classic Sam Francis book. And I was hoping you could start by laying out why Middle America finds itself in this situation. How is this place called the Heartland, that where you have a lot of the entrepreneurs and people who are familiar with America and what makes it work and its traditions and carrying those things forward, how'd they become the most disenfranchised people in the United States?
Yeah, there's a lot of different theories about that. And, the great question is, did they vote themselves into oblivion or were they betrayed by the elites? And I take the latter category, if for those of us on the right who recognize that American culture and American socioeconomics and politics is really the downstream from the confrontation of different elite classes and different elite groups. With someone who thinks that way, it's basically elite theory. You realize that the Middle America has had very few heroes, very few people who are willing to represent them and stand up for what was good for them. Because part of the problem is that it was much easier to benefit from the machinations of power if you didn't have to look out for those in the middle. And one of the things we'll probably talk about, defining the middle class. What does it mean to be an middle American? And I just want to really emphasize the fact that it's not just an economic class; it's also a cultural phenomenon too. I call them heritage Americans, but people who really represent the ethos and the spirit of America as it existed before the Civil Rights Revolution. There was nobody in Washington who was able to confront the revolutionary left. And you have this elite party that basically, took advantage of the managerial system at that time and over the, succeeding 50 to 100 years, depending on when you want to start that process. But basically, very few people stood up. You have people like George Wallace or Ross Perot in some ways, Pat Buchanan. There were some people, but really they just didn't have what it takes. And so I would describe the failure of the conservative movement to defend middle America as a great betrayal. They were betrayed. They were led to believe that the conservative movement and the Republican Party would be willing and able to defend them, to assert their ability to live life as they wanted to. And yet that conservative movement took all of its funds, all of its resources, all of its momentum, and basically just stacked up its own ability to take advantage of the power system and basically betrayed Middle America at large. So I would answer your question by saying Middle America has been betrayed by the elite. They didn't vote for this problem. They basically were just ignored.
Yeah, and I think that's critical because look, there are guys that I really respect and who I really love and who I think otherwise have great insights, but they'll say things like, "Well, the problem is just the Republican primary voter. If only we got out there and we just threw out the bums, got rid of the rhinos, we got really, vigorous in every primary and created some kind of consequence for this, then we would go ahead and see this change." And just looking, if you just want the just the latest example, the switch of Mike Johnson into the speakership, right? Just throwing out Kevin McCarthy, thinking that you're going to get some kind of significant change, and then finding out that actually you have someone who's just as bad or actually even worse behind him. It seems like this is just the story of the entire conservative movement in a microcosm, that they continue to say, well, we're going to get rid of these people. We're going to vote this out. We're going to vote for change. We're going to do something. And then there's just a stack of elites behind that all have the same ideology, and none of it is about protecting these people. And so I definitely want to get into that in detail. But we should probably do first what you were talking about there, which is to define middle America, because I would agree with you that there's a little bit of a tragedy. I mean, in some ways, it's very American, the fact that we don't identify class. Really, we don't have social classes in the way, or at least we don't think we have social classes in the way that many other European countries understood them. And so we tend to just boil down class into this crass economic structure. But of course, it makes no sense, because the barista making $13 an hour with a gender studies degree understands that she's in a different bracket on a different team than a plumber who's making $200,000 a year, right? They might be economically very different, but they know where they land. And the middle class is, in some ways, it does have some economic overlap. But like you said, this is really a group that in many ways is kind of the rural white evangelical, but not always. Like there's kind of an expansion around that identity. It is mostly that. It is centered in some ways on that, and that is certainly where the hatred of the left comes from. But that is not the sole identifier. So I wonder if you could lay out a little bit what it means to be a middle American.
Yeah, so that phrase, the very concept of and we're going to talk about the middle American radicals. So what happened in the post Civil War was, and a lot of this was derivative of the managerial revolution and sort of the economic changes that came after World War II. But Donald Warren was the sociologist, and he described this phenomenon that took place. He didn't use the managerial revolution as a phrase or as a concept. Of course, when I say managerial revolution, I'm talking about the insight of James Burnham. And that insight was picked up on by Sam Francis later. But you have this new economic system coming into play and really working itself out over the middle decades of the 20th century. And he described the situation where there was the power elite, and this power elite had basically centralized and consolidated their power during the New Deal era. And they basically had teamed up, and you can see this with LBJ and the Great Society, emphasizing the need for the state to prop up the lower classes, right? So you have this very economic dynamic, and the elites could accumulate power unto themselves by benefiting or giving resources to the lower classes. And the ones that did not receive any special benefit were the middle classes. The upper classes received all sorts of government contracts and grants and special privileges, and the lower classes would receive all sorts of subsidies and benefits in their own way. But the one group that didn't receive anything was the middle class. And this was described by him in economic terms. It was basically best thought of as income levels, where you live. Suburban America was basically overlooked in the 1970s. So he's the one that came up with this idea of the middle American radicals, because when you see that conception, when you see that framework of things being unleashed in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, you do find that middle class Americans were increasingly frustrated. They were the backbone of the American economy. They were the backbone of the electoral system. Everybody needed to capture their momentum if they wanted to be elected. And yet over time, they began to be pushed out, and their desires and their priorities, their struggles and their needs were basically overlooked. But what Sam Francis did is he realized that it's not clear enough to speak in terms of economics. You also need to add in a layer of culture there. And you really begin to see this, I think, in the 80s. This is when the paleoconservative movement really reached its height in the 80s and 90s with people like Pat Buchanan and others, Russell Kirk and others. They began to realize that there was more at play here. It wasn't just money that defined the middle class. There was also an entire way of life, an entire culture behind it. And we see now, and Pat Buchanan has his 1992 speech on the culture wars. The phrase culture wars is talked about all the time now. We recognize the fact that it's not just money at play, but it's who you represent, who you are, where your roots are. the way that you live your life and the priorities that you have culturally, those are the things that are being squashed out. And so this middle American radicalism began to basically transform into something that I think is much more culturally emphasized rather than economically emphasized.
Yeah, and that's important because, of course, I think some people watching this have probably heard about the high-low versus middle, right? The Bertrand de Juvenel formulation of how power often operates to consolidate. And a key function of that, like you said, is not just the economic aspect of it, but the fact that really what makes the middle something that power wants to erode is its establishment in the ways and traditions of the nation. The fact
Mhm.
that the people who are in the middle it's not just that they have the stability of money or property, though that is critical. It's also that they represent the old order. They have loyalties that are bound into ancient structures, and so they're far more likely to be interested in regional power, family, tribe, the basis of much more organic institutions. And so if power is going to consolidate, they need to go ahead and wear away not just at the economic aspect of the middle class, but also in that kind of cultural fortification that keeps it from being easily subsumed into the larger managerial structure. And of course, Sam Francis talks about this in Leviathan and His Enemies, that the bourgeoisie order had to be corroded, had to be corrupted in every way because it was not sufficiently centralized. It still had too much regional particularity built into the system. And that doesn't mean, again, just getting rid of property, though that's critical, but also getting rid of all those cultural institutions. So you talked about the transition and the kind of the rise of the paleocons. Now, maybe you can lay out for people because I think it's important for them to understand, when did these different shifts in the conservative movement take place? Because we're of course talking about the problems with the conservative movement and why it doesn't actually represent middle America. Obviously, there's a huge shift in kind of the 50s and 60s with the entrance of neoconservatives and their takeover of the movement. And the paleocons are actually more of a reaction to the neoconservative agenda than perhaps their own movement. So I wonder if you could lay out that transition for people so that they understand where the paleocons came from before we talk about what their mission was.
Yeah, so I would describe something called the old right, and the old right was actually, it was a collection of traditionalists, philosophical traditionalists, but also churchmen and businessmen, even media people back then. There was the McCormick who ran the Chicago Tribune in the 1940s. They were all against American intervention in World War II. Charles Lindbergh. It was all the old America First guys. And I would describe this as the old right. And the old right, their priorities were not in making the world a better place. They didn't care about saving Europe from some ideological threat. They just wanted to basically fortify their own well-being in their various regions and sectors on the American scene. So that's what I would, and part of the old right too included like some classical liberals, like, Albert J. Nock, Garrett Garrett, people like that. They were basically a New Deal coalition. They opposed the on the domestic scene, they opposed the managerial revolution and the centralization of economic power, but they also opposed American military force for the benefit of this imperial mindset that basically was rooted back into Woodrow Wilson and the progressivist demeanor on foreign policy. So this old right was this coalition that basically was liquidated, I would say, in the right after the war, the late 1940s, 1950s. Basically, America had a problem, and its problem was that it wasn't able to extend and expand its own hegemony in the world if people had more of a regionalist mindset. And so part of what happened is this new right came about, and this new right was led by people like Bill Buckley and National Review, and he started this long purge era of the conservative movement in which the cranks and the classical liberals and the constitutional dogmatists and the John Birchers and anyone that was considered unpalatable for the regime in Washington was basically just pushed out of the movement. Their funding was taken away. They were mocked and made fun of. So anyone that had much more of an older pre-World War II mindset and their definition of America was much older, they were basically pushed out. And so that was kind of the transition in the 50s and 60s from the old right to the new right. So that's the way that people like, like Paul Gottfried and Sam Francis, they would describe the new right, not as the post-Bush new right, but actually this post-war new right that took place. The neoconservatives came later as the Democratic Party began to, push its own, push the borders of its own sanity, you could say. The neoconservatives are those that wanted to basically, stop things in the 1950s and 1960s, and they basically infiltrated the Republican Party. And Paul Gottfried describes this in his book, The Conservative Movement. But basically, he makes the case that because the new right undermined the strength and integrity of the old right, the new right was therefore ripe for takeover. And the neoconservatives were able to take over the new right. And Bill Buckley wasn't entirely comfortable with a lot of them in the 1970s, but they were strategic masters. They were strategically brilliant, and they took over the Republic. There's this, the neoconservatives are not a large group. They're a very small group of people, ex-Trotskyites. They came from the left, and they basically captured the Republican Party. And so I would describe neoconservatism as a takeover of the new right, which had already undermined the integrity of the old right. And the paleoconservatives were, of course, aware of all of this happening ever since the beginning. But they described themselves as trying to, in some sense, issue some sort of counter-revolution against the neocons and take things back to the mentality of the 1930s and 1940s old right.
So can you explain the difference between perhaps in the piece you talk about how Russell Kirk was more of a traditionalist as opposed to maybe Francis or Gottfried, who were, you would qualify more as paleoconservatives. Obviously, they both opposed the direction that the conservative movement was taking. Both of these groups were canceled out of the conservative movement. But what was the distinction between their strategies that you feel set them apart?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So, people like Russell Kirk and while Roger Scruton is British, I would consider the way that he writes and thinks about things to be really similar, just sort of a European version of Russell Kirk. But I think that they had this mentality, this understanding of politics that is very helpful. And I think that they were pro-Burke. That is, they opposed revolutionary politics. They opposed universalism. They opposed this instinct that characterized the French Revolution. So they had very much a very helpful way of approaching politics. And the meaning of conservatism was basically cherished by them in a way that was not descriptive of the neoconservatives, which had much more of a Jacobin or revolutionary or universalist instinct. I think the neoconservatives are much less conservative than the traditionalists. The difference between the traditionalists and the paleoconservatives, I think, has much more to do with their understanding of what time it is in the West. When I read the traditionalists, they have this very much this mentality of the perennial good, the things that can basically transcend the moment, that we can reach way back into our Western heritage, whether we emphasize, Christendom, or whether we emphasize, Greek political thought or Roman culture, there's something that transcends the moment. And if we emphasize those things, there's always something there for us to grasp. The paleoconservatives, and by the way, I think Paul Gottfried was the one that coined that phrase, but they were much more confrontational. They recognized that Edmund Burke was not listened to. The traditionalists in the 1940s and 50s were not listened to. And so therefore we have to react accordingly. We can't pretend like there's this revolution coming down the road that's soon about to take us over. We need to consolidate our own appreciation for traditional institutions, but rather they think that if you want to identify the revolution, you have to look in the rearview mirror because it already came and it already went. And therefore, all of our institutions have been captured. All of the most important aspects of American socio-cultural and political life are already occupied by the enemies of Heritage America. And so the paleoconservatives realized that you couldn't have any conservative disposition. We couldn't act like Edmund Burke anymore because we'd already been taken over. We didn't listen to the warnings of those who warned against the Jacobins, and the Jacobins therefore captured everything. All of the things that we hold dear, the media, the arts, the educational institutions, the corporations, the entire managerial system, this private public conglomeration of interest groups had already weeded out heritage America. Any residues from the old world had already been taken over. And therefore, the paleoconservatives said that we can't have a conservative mentality, but instead we need a counter-revolutionary mentality, or what I call the insurgent demeanor.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I, of course, have talked about this as well, how critical it is for conservatives to understand that all these warnings about, oh, no, you're going to be past the point of no return. At some point, you're going to be past the point of no return. Well, you can't warn about that for 50 years straight and then pretend you didn't go past that point, right? At some point, you have to say, okay, no,
Yeah,
we went beyond it. And now that means there has to be a shift in our understanding of the scenario. It's not that I don't, believe in these principles or that I don't understand the value of a constitution or these institutions that you're trying to protect. I'm just letting you know that no matter how long you stand at this grave, the person inside it will be dead, right? And so
right.
at some point we have to deal with reality as it is. So I definitely want to get into the mentality shift because that's a big part of your article as well. And I think a critical part because it's something that people need to hear over and over again about how critical it is to shift the mentality and importantly the strategy attached to it. But before we talk about that, you also mentioned the role that the propositional nation
Mhm.
plays in this. And I think that's critical because I think it's very difficult. You talk about heritage America, and I think it's very difficult because so many Americans, even on the right, many conservatives in the mainstream movement, people who are, think of themselves as passionate conservatives, have a hard time of understanding America as anything other than freedom and liberty, right? Like
Right.
we've got a set of principles, we wrote them down on paper at one point, and anybody who raises their hand and says, "Yeah, that's me," well, then that's and even if they don't, even if they just walk in and at some point, get amnesty, well, then they have a piece of paper and that's America now.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that introduction of the idea of the propositional nation and how that has worked to undermine what would have been a more traditional right-wing understanding of what America is and how that provides continuity.
I think this was one of the most fundamental, I want to say contributions, but that makes it sound positive. But one of the fundamental elements of the new right was this idea that the meaning of all of America's experience and its documents and the phrases that built up the mythos of what America was were basically universalized in the 20th century after World War II. And so these very things that once defined Americans as inheritors of basically Anglo-Saxon Europe, they saw themselves as prolonging or applying in more consistent ways or protecting their rights as British citizens, at the very beginning, but then that would expand out a little bit, but they saw themselves as inheriting something that was part of who they were as a people. And so therefore it made no sense to them to think of concepts like rights and just their whole way of life. Human rights is a big one today. The Bill of Rights, we always speak in terms of their particular liberties and their particular institutions. And what happens when you universalize them is you sever them from the very real connection that they used to have with a culture. And when you sever that relationship and you universalize it, then the meaning of America in the 20th century basically became this conglomeration of abstractions or propositions. And anybody who adheres to those propositions or abstractions can become an American in equal footing as any other American whose parents or grandparents had been here for 7, 8 generations. And so therefore, since you're on equal footing, it makes no sense to talk in terms of us as a people with a specific heritage or a specific way of doing things that we inherited from our fathers, but rather it's something that anybody around the world can claim belongs to them as well. And so you have this new meaning of America based on the universalization of phrases and rhetoric, rhetorical framing. I think that describes the new right, and it therefore became something that could apply to anybody around the world. And therefore, it made no sense to distinguish between cultures coming in or distinguish between cultures that were already here, because as long as somebody assented to the proposition, that made them an American in equal standing. And you continue to chip away at this old this old way of looking at politics, which is the continuity over time of peoples to live their lives as their fathers had lived them, and for them to do that as prolonging their heritage, as being conduits between their parents' generation and their children's generation. That's what a very conservative way of looking at things. But when you sever that dynamic and you instead make everything about individuals assenting to propositions, you completely change the character of the American nation without changing the rhetorical framing of it. And so it was kind of, people were tricked into it, basically. You have things like, the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights belonged to the people who wrote that. And if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, it was written for them and their posterity. But now you can't think in terms of them and their posterity. You have to think in terms of anybody who has sense. And so by keeping the rhetorical framing, but universalizing the concepts, you've basically initiated a revolution against heritage America and on behalf of this new imperial universalist America that we're now seeing the poison, come to fruition.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do with this whenever someone engages in this kind of propositional nation discussion, like, oh, it's just assenting to a creed. It's like, okay, well, what happens when they renounce it? Like, what happens when this person speaks out against America? They lose their citizenship, right? No,
Yeah.
no, no, no. Of course not. Okay, so what does this mean, right? And the
Yeah.
answer is nothing. It's completely an empty shibboleth for advancing a revolution. And many conservatives have basically become stalwart defenders of a revolution that was sold to them in the disguise of, like you said, the rhetoric of the founders. They thought that they were supporting the vision of the founders, but they didn't understand the vision of the founders. And so instead they ended up buying a revolution lock, stock, and barrel, and just, painting some stars and stripes on the side of it. So I wonder, we know that this is a powerful group. We've talked a little bit about the dynamics, obviously, of power and why it wants to sell out the middle. But you would think that at some point there would still be a constituency for this large, competent, successful class of people who contribute to society. But we've both already said that the elites sold out these people, right? Not that they voted for, but the elites were willing to. What was the incentive structure that has put so much of the conservative movement in the mindset where, well, really, I should be selling out the very people who are going to make my country functional? I mean, obviously, that's a suicide pact in the long run. What incentive made them line up this way?
I think that's a very complex, set of answers to that question. I would emphasize a couple things. One, this is like the libertarian, background coming out, but I really think, there's corruption in central banking and the corruption of the money, things like that. I think are very important to talk about. But I actually think the logic of the civil rights movement and the logic of the civil rights, the new constitution, as Christopher Caldwell describes it, basically it created an incentive structure where almost by definition, you couldn't see middle Americans as being the victims of anything. And if they weren't the victims of anything, then you couldn't use administrative law and you couldn't use administrative mechanisms in order to, provide solutions for them as victims. So anybody who wasn't part of Heritage America could basically claim victim status in some ways. And we can see today there's always a new victim group popping up because there's the logic built into the civil rights movement that anything can be claimed to be the result of some perceived injustice. And therefore you can utilize administrative precedent, administrative, grants and infrastructure and resources and mechanisms. You can use that to heal whatever victim group has been victimized or oppressed by basically Heritage America. It's never the elites that are oppressing people. It's always actually the Heritage Americans, their way of life and the things that they stand for. Those are the very oppressive institutions. And so you have this dynamic where at first it was claimed to be African Americans or and then it was transformed to claim outside of that you could have people from other parts of the world, the third world, like the southeastern China. You could even have now different sexual classes, groups of people claim victim status, and you continue to build onto that. And what you realize is the only ones standing against that are the heritage Americans. And therefore, it's actually in everybody's best interest, including the elites and including the victims of society, to liquidate heritage Americans, because they're the ones that are getting in the way of the full emancipation and, a drive for equality that all of these other minority groups talked about. And so actually the heritage Americans are hurdles in the quest for justice. And therefore, it's not only that they shouldn't get any special favor from the federal government, but actually that they need to be liquidated. Their entire way of life and culture needs to be decimated, because you can't have a new constitution if they're still attached to the old one.
Yeah, and you can see it's so sad. It's so slavish that the conservatives are locked into this as well. Kevin McCarthy saying, "Oh, well, the Democratic Party looks more like the real America," right? Even the people who are supposed to actually stand up for heritage Americans want to replace them. They want to get rid of them. They're embarrassed that they have to represent these people, and they can't wait to swap them out for a constituency that the New York Times would be more likely to praise them for. The first thing, whenever a new minority and whenever a new special group is created, the conservative movement doesn't push back against it. They just rush to go get their own version of that. Let's go grab some Blair Whites or something. We got to get
Right.
the new conservative trans person, right? That
Yeah,
that that
exactly.
that's the only thing they can think of to validate their position, is to buy deeply into the revolution, not in any way to oppose it. And that really brings us to the mentality shift, because like you said, you're at this point now where you're well through the looking glass. All the easy, off ramps are well behind us. And now we're in the situation where all of these people in the middle, all of these radical middle Americans have lost all power, right? They have no institutions, no one is standing up for them. Jeremy Carl does a great job in his new book, The Unprotected Class, talking about basically how the one group you can't find on any college campus, any elite campus, is a middle American. You can find many minorities, you can find white students who are linked to the liberal ruling elite, but you can't find anyone from Oklahoma. And
Mhm.
so increasingly these are people without any access to institutions, any access to power. And you talk about the piece, how Sam Francis envisioned the idea of the revolution from the middle, how people who are completely devoid of this institutional apparatus can find a way to fight back when there's really no one in the elite that's currently championing.
Yeah. So this is the thing, and what Sam Francis hints at, or says explicitly, is that what they need is sort of a class consciousness, in a way, not and I wouldn't even describe this as economic. I think a lot of like suburban whites are very taken over by the liberal revolution as well. So it's not even like economic, so like it's actually much more of a, who do you represent? What way of life do you represent? And coming together along this, and it's sort of a version of identity politics. I don't think it needs to be like racially essentialist, but it definitely needs to be correlated with those who have this instinct and this demeanor for those that have their roots here in America. And since we're the only group of people as middle Americans or as heritage Americans who are basically being led unto our cultural death, in order to confront the revolution, we actually need to have some sort of counter-revolutionary consciousness. We need to recognize ourselves as those who represent the way of life of our grandparents and great grandparents, and those who came before and blazed the trail and settled this country. We need to think of ourselves as their heirs, and therefore, what they did for us generations ago, we're doing in their honor, but also for the sake of those who come after us as heritage Americans. And so this sort of recognition of not what propositions do we assent to, but who we are and what culture we will aspire to preserve and to reassert, not just preserve, because that was the problem with conservatism, is it attempted to hold the fort down, but what we need is a reaffirmation of those things, a reassertion. And that's what makes it counter-revolutionary, because we're not just hiding in the caves, but we're actually saying, this is who we are, this is the way that we want to live, and we're willing to wield power in defense of ourselves. And I think that's what it means to have a counter-revolutionary consciousness.
So what are the practical applications? We have an understanding now of like how you should understand yourselves, the shift in mentality, But what do the boots on the ground reality look like if you don't have access to any of these institutions? If entryism doesn't work because the people who are already in these establishments are perfectly aware of the long march of institutions because they did it, and they're
Mhm.
certainly not going to leave the door open for you. We have the Chris Rufo model, and I have a lot of respect for Chris. He's been on the show. He's obviously the most effective advocate for a lot of the things that are happening on the conservative move right now. One of the most powerful activists we've seen on the right for a long time. But his version of this seems to be kind of to like brute force the institution doors back
Right.
open.
Right.
And then there are others who think that they should kind of sneak in the back door. But what was Francis's idea? How did he think that you could reassert power?
Yeah, let me just set this up by saying that this is not, most people don't have this type of thing within their grasp. So everybody, people are frustrated. People listening to the show, they want to know desperately, what do we do? Do we run for school board? What do we do? And I would answer, everybody has its own circle and its own way of doing things. And for some people, the best you could possibly do is to live well, work hard, and have children. Some people are set up to be in local politics, but there are those who can live lives as sort of a vanguard, and they actually have the opportunities to think 50, 60 years down the road, because that's what we have to do right now. This is not a 4 or 5 year project. This is a 50, 60 year long project. When you think about the post-Marxist left, like in the 50s, during fascism in Italy, and during, even in America, the new left was not popular. They had to sit and they had to work out, how do we, as revolutionaries living at the margins of society, how do we capture the institutions? They had to grapple with these things. And I think that we need to grapple with them as well. This is not an immediate term project. This is not about voting Trump in. This is not even about voting a Pat Buchanan in. This is about, how do we think in long term? Because if the left, if their way of life and if their revolution is inherently fragile, and I think that it is, I don't think it's consistent with what it means to be a human being and what it means to have an authentic culture, but they're constantly having to revolutionize society. That's just the nature of the left. Then there are going to be opportunities to provide stability in an age of instability. And so the way that Francis dealt with this is he looked deeply at the communist agitator Antonio Gramsci. And Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini in fascist Italy, as he was a Marxist and someone who wanted to basically capture the institutions in the West. And he realized, in the course of his imprisonment, in the course of his own failure, that they could not do things the way that the Bolsheviks did. They could not just simply capture the reins of state power like they were able to do. Once Russia was taken over by the Bolsheviks, they won. They defeated everybody. It wasn't like that in the West. In the West, you had much more of this cultural hegemonic strength that bolstered the ability for Western culture and American culture specifically to survive any formal capture of power. They therefore needed to create this stronghold of institutions. And everybody knows about the long march through the institutions, the way they did it that way, but that was actually their backup plan. Their immediate plan was to basically create parallels. They wanted to create groups of people and be their own vanguard on the left and slowly build up alternative ways of life that the American hegemonic culture couldn't compete with, because they had this idea of a left-wing utopia that was basically more appealing than what was going on in the 1940s America. The problem was, the reason that Gramsci and other communist revolutionaries failed at that is because the core of American culture was still at that time much more conservative. They had no interest in participating in their alternative lifestyles and their parallels. And I think even though the masses have been revolutionized and liberalized today, I still think that basic instinct exists in America. It's one of the few places in the West. I think if you look at Germany and France and England and all, Scotland and all these other places, you realize that the core of American population is still very, especially in flyover America, is still very conservative. And I think that they are radicalizing on cultural lenses. They are becoming much less enthusiastic about, affirming gay rights or whatever, they need to affirm to fit in to polite society in America, I think that they're becoming radicalized and they're willing to use state power in whatever way they can get a hold of it. And so I would say the best way in a meaningful way is to organize, and it's going to take decades to organize, but you need to be radicalizing your neighbor. You need to be forming coalitions. You need to be forming associations. You need to be creating networks of strength. You need to be convincing people that they don't need to depend on welfare because you at the church can provide that. You need to be thinking as a counter-revolutionary, because this is the very mode of operation that the post-Marxist left, thought of themselves as living on the margin. They were completely unacceptable to polite society, and yet somehow 40 years later they captured all the institutions. So I would say that the core of the answer is not to become a professor. I mean, if your path in life is to become a professor, and you'll probably get fired, but
Yeah.
I would suggest creating parallels. And people do this all the time with monetary parallels, or there's all sorts of like online learning, but I'm talking about boots on the ground, moving into the right position and taking over county level stuff. There's no reason why a county level counter revolution cannot happen here. I think about all the counties that I've visited in the last year and how red pilled they are becoming about how bad things are being run at the state level, about the country level. Like I think, like for instance, Tennessee is a good example. All these corporations moving into Nashville and how blue Nashville's becoming. But at the county level in rural Tennessee, they're actually going the other direction. And I think these are the opportunities that people need to look for. Take over your counties and start telling the state level apparatus, no, we're not going to take your funds. We're not interested in your subsidies. We're going to survive on our own. Start supporting each other. And I think by creating these types of parallels, what you're playing into is the very backbone of American cultural life that Gramsci and his revolutionaries were unable to capture themselves. And I think since those things still exist, we as counter-revolutionaries on the right can leverage them, radicalize them, and wield them eventually against state level power.
I think that's right. I advocate for something very similar in my book, The Total State. And I think that that really is key as someone who lived in Florida under the beneficence of, Governor DeSantis during everything that was the COVID pandemic. I recognize the drastic difference. The stories I heard from New York and California and all these other places where life was just absolutely shut down and insane. And after the first month or two here in Florida, things were pretty much just normal, right? And that all comes down to the fact that you had, a governor and you had a legislature and you had counties that were willing to just say, no, we don't care. We're not doing this and you can't make us. Same thing when we saw what happened with some of the gun legislation in Illinois, I believe it was, where where the state's trying to basically ban guns, and the sheriffs just say, no, we're just not enforcing this law. This law is unconstitutional. And so people often doubt how critical it can be to just have these very basic firewalls. And I should say, when I say basic, I don't mean that it's easy. It takes a lot of work. Like you said, it's a generational project of organization, informing people, making people understand what time it is, making them understand how radically important it is for them to take action and make sure that they build this bulwark. But just having these things in place can be really critical, and they can completely change the life for you and your family when these kind of things hit.
Can I
Now, the
can I
one,
just can I just
oh,
jump
sure.
in real
Yeah.
quick? Just I know we have listener questions, but they're just real quick. Let me, as an example, like let's say a county level, let's say there was like a pride parade, and they wanted to do this, and a county level group said, no, we're actually not going to allow that on our streets because it's completely inconsistent with the well-being and strategic or the cultural stability of our county. Let's just say they made that argument. What the state would do is they would probably respond by withholding funds, and they say, fine, we're not going to fund your developments. We're not going to give you subsidies and grants and stuff like that. What the counter revolutionaries have to do is say, fine, we don't want your money. See, this is how they get these county levels to participate, is
Yep.
they hand out millions of dollars in development subsidies and all kinds of stuff. What it's going to take is people saying, we're willing to sacrifice the cheap money and the cheap wealth effect just to survive and keep our cultural way of life. Those are the things that we have to do too, is we have to tell the state, no, we're not interested in your participation. We would rather figure it out ourselves than take part in your struggle sessions.
That's exactly right. This is the leash that the federal government uses the states, and states use to county and locals, is that pyramid of funding is what really makes sure that they can dictate things down to these levels. And if you can find a way, if you're willing to make the sacrifices and to put in
Sacrifice.
the work to go ahead and cut that spigot off, there's very little outside of actually like sending the National Guard down to enforce something that these people can actually do. And if
Right.
you're just willing to stand up there. So the one thing that pushback that I consistently get when I float this strategy, and I'm sure you've heard it too, is like eventually, sure, okay, you build your super based world down in your county or in your state. But then at some point, the federal government or the state government says, oh, based world's a problem. We're just going to go knock over your sandcastle. So if, unless you're, building some kind of radical militia, then you're just wasting your time, right? Because if you're building a more functional society, if these guys ultimately decide that they don't want it to be there anymore, they can just go over and knock that over. And the thing that I always point them to is I got a buddy, Ernst Van Zyl, in South Africa, and he helps to work with Afroforum, and they set up these parallel institutions there. And whenever anyone brings that up to me, he just says, "Okay, but in the meantime, like my society is run better. Like my family, my friends, my people get to live in a better society, and maybe this highly incompetent state will eventually come for this stuff, but maybe they won't. And if I don't set this up, if I don't create this, then no one else will." What do you say to people who, say, well, eventually the government's just going to come knock over your sandcastle?
So I actually what I would answer with is I think that that assumes that there is still legitimacy in the federal government, and I think that people don't realize the extent to which delegitimization has characterized the last 10 years. I think that's what
Mhm.
Trump is all about.
That's right.
And I think that instead of sending troops in to knock over your sandcastle, what they're actually going to do is they're going to blow a lot of hot air, which is what they did with Abbott on the border.
Yep.
And I think calling their bluff is a much more way to spark. Um, I mean, well, first of all, we can get to the issue of martyrdom. Martyrdom is a very powerful aspect of our cause as well. But I think that more people stand up and call their bluff, what you're going to see is that the federal government has lost the legitimacy and moral authority to make threats like that. And I don't think that they'll pull it off. And if they do pull it off, that's when you get the martyr effect. If they really do come in and you're willing to sacrifice for your cause, they're going to stomp one spider and let loose thousands more, because I don't think that they have the legitimacy to do that anymore. It's not 1980. We're not the most powerful country in the world. I mean, people know that the entire structure of the American mythos, the idea that the American regime is sort of at the height and zenith of world history, I think that's coming apart. And I think that people see the United States as much more of a bother in their life and something that's not necessary. And I think calling their bluff is going to be much easier than people anticipate.
Yeah, this is like the January 6th or Trump trial effect, right? In one instance, you can say, oh, well, they're cracking down, they're punishing these people with draconian punishments, they're trying to eliminate the political opposition. And yeah, all of that's true. That's an attempt to flex that power. But at the same time, what they're doing is sacrificing the legitimacy of all of these institutions in order to crush what is relatively small beans. And so when they do this, they end up putting all of their, social the social fabric that's left, all of the air of legitimacy and power, the political formula that holds them together and gives them that legitimacy, all starts to be called into question. And yeah, it might give you some security for a moment, like you said, you might get to stomp one or two spiders, but what you end up doing is destroying the system that was really in place. And once you do that, it's only a matter of time before the questions from the audience I want to have time to get to. So we're going to switch over to that. But before we go to the questions of the people, CJ, where can people find all of your excellent work?
At Contra Mortar on Twitter is the easiest way to find me. I have a Substack too, but just follow me on Twitter and then you can see all my updates at Contra Mortar.
Excellent. All right. So Thego says, were the post-war New Right basically neoliberal corporatists?
I wouldn't call them. I mean, corporatists. Like, do they represent the corporations? Not necessarily. Are they corporatists in the sense that they advocate for the fusion of, capital and state? There's some of that too, but I think they were much more ideological than anything. I think that they were much more interested in strengthening the American regime for the sake of the Cold War and liberal hegemony in Europe. I think that they saw the function of America as basically needing to shore up Europe after World War II, and they were much more interested in ideology than they were in any economic relations. Of course, it's very profitable to run an empire as well, so there's that aspect. But a lot of that's just rent seeking. But I think a lot of it was basically just this attempt to create this Western super state that fulfilled their own understanding of historical development.
Tiny Stupid Demon says, yes, the issue I've had with conservatives for some time is that the thing they're trying to conserve does not exist, but people continue to hold on to their delusions because losing them hurts. How this is something that I think is important. I think it's important for people to communicate what time it is without completely scaring off legitimate middle Americans, heritage Americans who care about this. I think the mistake that many people on like the online right make is they want to come in and just say, I'm here to shatter all of your dreams and tell you that the revolution is upon us. But I found that that is a strategy that does not necessarily play well with a lot of people who would otherwise be your allies. How should people approach the conservative, the average conservative, to let them know that yes, many of these things are no longer able to be conserved, but there is a connection to the past that allows a continuity to what they love?
I would emphasize the frustrations that they're already feeling. The thing that we have to our advantage is that we don't have to muster up or we don't have to conjure up some frustration that we can apply to them. They're already frustrated. They already know that there's a war being declared on their world and their memories and the things that they cherish. They cherish these things at the sentimental level, not at the rationalistic one. And so we can play into that. There was the great debate in during the immigration debates. I guess it was in the 70s with Enoch Powell. I'm sure some people have seen this, but he was describing the future of England as being extremely damaging for those who have 1,000-year history in England. And he was accused of conjuring up and making it, and creating frustrations in people. And he constantly said, "No, I'm just their echo. I'm just being there for them to. I'm a conduit, a mechanism through which they can express their frustrations. Their frustrations already exist. They already know that there's a war being declared on them. So the solution is to play into that, to leverage that, to fuel that fire so that they are willing to look for other alternatives. And at the same time, you're not asserting some utopian vision of the new world, but you're reasserting the reinvigoration of the things that they love and the heritage that they wish they could see praised again. So that's what we're doing, is we're leveraging frustration that already exists, and we're asserting a heritage that is deep within our souls.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go back and watch Enoch Powell, you've been told the story about this fire breathing dragon. And when you see him on many of these late night shows, the hosts are even befuddled because they expect this wild eyed guy. And really, he is just saying exactly what you're talking about. Look, I'm not here saying anything new. I'm just the echo, I'm just the representation of what the people already know. And
Right.
so I'm not saying anything radical. And that's the thing. It's like, in some ways, it's radicalization, right? But in other
Mhm.
ways, it's not radical at all. It's simply a realization of what is true and that has taken people so long to remember or be allowed to say. And that's what Trump did. That's it. That's his greatest strength, was just giving people the ability to recognize and say the things that they'd wanted to say for a very long time.
Exactly.
Scott Galloway says, or sorry, Jacob Zendel says, Galloway had a viral rant recently where he made a very compelling argument for left populist economic focus, re-cost of housing, education, low wages. Could this be co-opted by the right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Like, first of all, I would say when it comes to a culture war, you want to, you know, you've said this before, but we're in the looting the treasury phase of American decline, and right. So the point is not to uphold these ultimate principles of what it would be like. How do we come up with a system that's extremely principled and you can balance the budget and all these things, but rather what you need to do is you need to work for those who are your fellow heritage Americans. That's part of having a counter-revolutionary mindset. So a good example of this would be like, okay, here's a good example of this. Ron Paul. So Ron Paul, when they did these budgets, back when he was a congressman, he would vote against the budget. He'd vote against the budget, because he didn't want to fund it with new taxes and new inflation, all this stuff. But he would vote yes for the carve outs for his county. And that's just, I mean, you don't have to do it exactly like this, but that's a good way of thinking about it. Look, since they're spending the money anyways, you might as well capture it. So you might as well. So a good example of this would be like student loans. Like I'm all for, seizing the endowments of Harvard and other revolutionary institutions in America, seizing their endowments, capturing the money that they use extremely inappropriately, extremely against our way of life, using those funds to pay for the student loans of families. And if you pay for the student loans of families and maybe you get more student loans paid off per child or something like this, you're inevitably going to weigh the benefits of that system or that mechanism. You're definitely, I mean, families are mostly those who are consistent with or adjacent to Heritage America. So just start with things like that. You can benefit your own people. I mean, you can't, if you conjure up this utopian world where you'd capture money and then give it to your buddies, that wouldn't fly. But if you took money that's already been allocated, that's being used for revolutionary purposes, or for instance, if you can pull back, our military expansionism in the Middle East, like in Afghanistan or Ukraine, all these other like wastes of money, you can take those funds and give it to like veterans, right? That's money that's already being allocated. And by doing so, you're actually, without even trying too hard, giving it proportionately to Heritage Americans. I mean, those are little things that we can do to think in terms of where are our enemies, how are they using our money, and how can we use those resources in a way that benefits our people.
Yeah, I really encourage people to abandon ideological thinking. The whole point of this is you are here, like you said, to help Heritage Americans. All right, what does that look like? Well, you want them to have housing they can afford. You want them to be able to raise a family with one person working. You want these things. These are not leftist ideas. These are healthy ideas for the people that you are trying to protect. So don't worry about the ideological implications of every given policy. Worry more about whether or not it benefits your friends, the people you're trying to protect. And if the
Exactly.
answer is yes, then engage in
Because the thing is, your enemies are operating on that standard while
that.
you're staying principled. That's how the conservative movement lost. Your enemies operate on identity politics, and they've convinced you to operate on principle. Who's going to win that fight?
And to be very clear, I have a principle, and the principle is
Right.
helping the people who are part of my group. Like
Correct.
that's the principle.
That's the
Like
principle.
and that's a good principle. Like
Yes.
that's actually what you should have. Your principles should not be some abstract ideology. Your principles should be I would like to protect Americans. I would like Americans to see the benefit of the taxes they pay. I would like to see Americans have their borders closed. I would like to see Americans be protected by their military. Those are my principles.
Mhm.
It has nothing to my principles are not abstract economic ideologies. My principles are grounded in a people and a place, and rather than being grounded in, whether or not they line up with some, abstract university idea of any particular application of political science.
Mhm.
Florida Henry here says, when Perot ran and predicted what has happened to us, the Republicans ripped him viciously. Many
Agree.
such cases.
Yeah, many such cases.
That's absolutely right. Florida Henry says, what have conservatives conserved? Trump got Roe versus Wade overturned, but he's not a conservative or even a Republican. Yeah, and I think that really does speak to the power, again, of non-ideological thinking. Trump walked in and he didn't know the rules, right? He's not an ideologue. He's not even really a Republican, but he walks in and he's like, all right, I'm a businessman. I'm a salesman. I want to sell myself to these guys. What do they care about? And then he did the unthinkable. He just said what he thought they wanted to hear. And in some cases did what he thought they wanted them to do. And that's
Right.
not what the conservative movement does. It runs around screaming about like the principles of the ideology that they have written down on the flow chart and do nothing about actually helping
This is a good
conservatives.
example. This is a good example of how politics is more meaningful than just like ideology. I mean, because it was the dynamics of politics that created a situation in which the Supreme Court could actually pull that off. If it wasn't for politics, if it was only for ideology, Roe v. Wade would still be the law of the land.
Thuggo here says, we we lost some big legislative battles: income tax, Federal Reserve, 2008 bailout, Civil Rights Act. How do we proceed? Yeah, obviously the weight of kind of just the law at this point is overwhelming for the right. We're seeing some battles won. I mean, we look at possibly the overturning of affirmative action. We have that ruling, but does it actually get applied? These kind of things matter. But what do conservatives do when, like you said, the overwhelming amount of legislative and judicial battles have gone against them, and all of that, the stack of that is kind of weighing down on the movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of what I was saying is creating a counter-revolutionary consciousness. I mean,
Mhm.
that is the best answer here. You're not going to take back Harvard. You're not going to take back Yale. You're not going to take back the Department of Education. What you're going to do is you're going to convince your fellow heritage Americans that they don't need those schools anymore, that we have our own way of doing things, that we're going to defend ourselves, that we're going to supply goods and services for ourselves, and we're not interested in the managerial system anymore. I think that's ultimately the ethos, the instinct that needs to be developed and fostered.
Yeah, the only way to defeat the total state is to remove yourself from dependence on it. That's
Mhm.
that's really the ground on which you have to build everything else. Cherub Cow says, Engel, thoughts on preventing national divorce with a recapture strategy? Obviously, a lot of people on the right are advocates or think that national divorce is inevitable. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's possible. I wouldn't counter signal it though. I think that those movements can be leveraged and utilized. I think that we can be friends with national divorce people. I also don't think that we should make it a make or break thing that, like, if you're not interested in it, you are banished from our, momentum or something like that. I think that they have good instincts. I think that they I don't think it's very possible. We're too interrelated for that, and there's too much going on. I don't think that the managerial elite are going to allow anything like that. So I don't want to spend too much bandwidth on stuff like that. But the power of nullification at the county level, I think, is just as it can be just as impactful. Because the managerial system at the national level, it really does depend on lower level power being part of the tax farm. It really does allow them or rely on them to participate. And so I don't think you need national divorce, but I also don't want to counter signal my friends. And I think they are allies. I think they are good people who have good instincts. Obviously, there's some wacky libertarians involved, but they're just going to always be there, and there's nothing you can do about them.
So true. Forge and Anvil says the CJ guy seems like a good podcast guest. Well, if you like him as a guest, you should check him out as a host. Actually, CJ, make sure you plug your podcast. You didn't do that when we were talking.
Well, you did it for me, but I do Chronicles and Contra Mundum, but I know Forge and Anvil, and he's taking a pot shot at me because I bail on him for his podcast. So,
Oh, okay. I didn't
yeah.
realize shade was being thrown in the
Yes.
super
Yeah. And you
chats
got
here.
paid for it too.
Yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it. All right. Anyone else wants to throw an apple at CJ? Now's your moment. Uh Cooper Weirdo says calling someone stupid and telling them that their worldview is a lie doesn't work. But when Yarvin is debating someone, to be fair, I think that actually does work sometimes. But yeah, I hear you. Let's see. I'm gonna pronounce this very wrong. Sorry. Janelli Guevara Jackson says, is it possible for blacks to be heritage Americans if your family have been here since the 1700s, especially if you're traditional heritage culture?
Yeah. So I define heritage American as anyone whose mentality and their instincts are for the America as it was conceived in the 1800 or 1700s, 1800s, even early 1900s. And I think part of the mosaic of the American development as it existed is there was this clash of worlds with European settlers and the Native Americans, in southern, South Americans, but Americans who lived in the South, and the Black culture there. And I think that a lot of these people who, like, a good example of this would be like someone like Booker T. Washington. There's this distinction that is made often in the South between the old Black culture and the new Black culture. This new Black culture that was kind of facilitated by the power elite in the 20th century. Has created a lot of damage for Americans and for blacks in general. And Thomas Sowell talks about all of this, the damage that the managerial system has had on them. But I don't define heritage American in a racially essentialist way. I do think there's a lot of correlation. There were definitely Anglo institutions, Anglo instincts, Anglo culture that predominated the American scene. But I think that there was some sort of integration between the European dominated settlers and some of these other cultures and subgroups on the margins, including Native Americans and Black Americans. So that's why I do say Heritage American, because there is this older America. I mean, there were tensions and struggles there, but that's part of our experience and history. So I don't really have a racially essentialist view of things, but I very much do have if your instincts and your connections are pre-Ellis Island, or even post Ellis Island, but mostly pre-Ellis Island, then you're a Heritage American. I think that's part of the development and trajectory of American mosaic.
Yeah, there's a Clarence Thomas shaped plug in the dam that's holding back the destruction of Heritage America. I
Yeah.
mean, the man is basically got the Constitution, or what's left of it, aloft on his shoulders. So yeah, I think it's fair to call Clarence Thomas a Heritage American, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Jacob Zindel says Galloway completely omitted immigration. Could this be a reformulation into a platform of net zero immigration, affordable housing, and decimation of progressive education institutions? Great guess. Yeah, I don't really know Galloway, so I'm not familiar with what he said. But I think, yeah, this is already, to be fair, this is what I talk about all the time. Like these are issues that I'm hitting 24/7. So yeah, do I think that this platform is a good one? Absolutely. In fact, it's the one I've been doing my very best to forge as much as possible as I can on this show. I'm not familiar with Galloway, but if he's saying the same thing, then yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with him either. So
Yeah. And then Robert Weisfeld says, "Can an Italian Catholic American and or Jewish American asking for a friend become a Heritage American?" Totally asking, totally okay if not. America first.
So
Yes, America first, double yes.
So the point of using phrases like Heritage American is I think we should get rid of the rationalism. Like
Yes.
the point is not to go by every single person and look up his genetic makeup and then,
This is not a one drop rule scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not how it works. It's more of an ethos. It's more of it's much broader than that. We don't need the problem. This is actually how the left wins, is they get you nailed down into these very precise definitions of things, and you get so focused on this guy yes, this guy no, that you actually lose the entire momentum of things. So I think it's sort of a spectrum. I think the old British stock is like the ultimate Heritage American, and as you go out to Germany and France, and out from there to, yes, Italians are part of that spectrum, and then you get out even further to the third world. At some point along the spectrum, it gets too far away, but we don't need to have some rationalistic answer to things. I think the Ellis Island immigration was bad for America. I think it created the New Deal Democratic Party and all that. But at this point, the whole point of politics is to look at who your allies are and who your enemies are, and to act accordingly.
Yeah, there's a if for people who are looking for more on this, even the perennial traditionalists like Spangler and Evola talked about the understanding of nation as purely genetic, as something that was a disaster. Like that this is a component, but that there's a larger understanding of this as well. So this is not some new revisionist, conservative version of national identity or nationhood or peoplehood. This is something that reaches back to older voices in this. So the shed, like you said, shed this like rationalist, materialist understanding of peoples, and grounded into something that's far more traditional and vibrant and I think organic to what actually constitutes a people and a way of life.
Mhm.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, but thank you everybody for coming on. Of course, or rather watching. Thank you to CJ for coming on. And of course, make sure you check out all of his work. If it's your first time on this channel, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe, turn on the bell, the notifications, so you can catch these streams when they go live. Love the questions as you guys provide, but of course, you got to catch these streams if you want to put in the questions. If you'd like to go ahead and get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron McIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. When you do rating and review, it helps with the algorithm. And of course, my new book, The Total State, is out. Lots of people picking it up. It's awesome. It's been getting a great response. I'm doing a lot of media hits for it. So, of course, you can catch me on many of your favorite shows. I just did Dinesh D'Souza and Eric Metaxas today. And if you want to pick it up, you can grab it on Amazon. And when you do, of course, ratings there also help. Thank you, everybody, once again for watching. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.